is a book review of Nassim Taleb's Skin in the Game. It's the last instalment of his Incerto series, a collection of books about uncertainty. Incerto is Latin for uncertainty, and it's about the nature of reality and how chaos and the unexpected have a huge and dramatic role in shaping our lives and the world around us in ways that are overlooked by academia and so-called experts. Once again, Nassim Taleb is very critical of what you could call the academic establishment, professors, institutions, universities, generally what he often refers to as men with ties, people with ties. He very much takes a contrarian, anti-authoritarian, irreverent attitude towards economic professors, in that they get a number of key things wrong. The Black Swan, which he wrote about way back in around 2003, 2004, but also something called ergodicity. Ergodicity is a key concept which comes up again and again in this book. So what I'd like to do is just try to explain it. It's quite a complex statistical phenomenon, and it did take me quite some time watching YouTube videos to try to get my head around it. But I'll just do my best to explain it, because it's one of the key things I learned from this book. Before I do that, I'll just give you a brief oversight of what the book is about. So Skin in the Game is about how human behaviour changes when people have skin in the game, when they are taking risks and they live by the consequences of their actions. He starts off with looking at something called Hammurabi. Hammurabi, I think, is the code of ancient Babylon. It's one of the oldest codes of law. I think it's called Hammurabi. Sorry, let me just get that right. He starts with it very early on in the book. Hammurabi code, legal code. And one of the laws passed on that ancient, they wrote the laws on this stone, but one of the laws was that the architect of a house, should that house collapse and kill the occupants, he should also face the death sentence or death penalty. In other words, the architect of a faulty house should face the consequences of building a house which meant that the owner, the occupant of the house, died due to its collapse. And he talks about how this encourages home builders, but he also extends this to aeroplane pilots, in that aeroplane pilots quite obviously have skin in the game. They have an interest in ensuring that the aeroplane is fully or is as safe as possible, and that there aren't, or they try to minimise tail risk. So highly improbable but hugely impactful risks, and consequently the quality of housing, the quality of homes improves. You can see this effect in the US. Arguably it's a good system, because if people are able to sue others, that ensures there's skin in the game, and this improves the quality of what's being built in the case of homes, or in the case of aeroplanes. the quality of aeroplanes has increased every year. And he talks about something called the Lindy effect as well, which he applies to restaurants, in that restaurant owners, they very much have skin in the game, because what they put on the table, the food that they are offering customers, if it's not a good product, if it doesn't taste very nice, customers are not going to keep going to that restaurant. The restaurant's going to go out of business. And so the Lindy effect is things that have survived for a period of time, as long as they're non-perishable. So a human is perishable, we age and eventually we die. But for things that are non-perishable, how long they live for is an indication of how long they are likely to live for in the future. So if things have survived a long time, they're more likely to survive for at least as long as they already have, if you see what I mean. So the Egyptian pyramids, for example, they're 5,000 years old, they're very strong, robust, resilient, they're likely to be there in 5,000 years' time. And so he calls these systems robust, anti-fragile as well. The aeroplanes, restaurants, and home builders, they're an example of anti-fragility, because they're the opposite of fragility. When there's chaos or vulnerability or variance, an earthquake, for example, or severe weather conditions, they actually gain, over time, these things gain in robustness, because they're improved. And of course, life is the ultimate form of anti-fragility, because of evolution, in that subsequent generations survive, and we get better at survival. So do other animals and other living things. And so of course we are in a constant state of evolution, of change, of development. But he talks about some of these things in this book. This is what the book is about. He's very critical of politicians who make policies that affect people other than themselves, because they don't have to live by the consequences of those actions. He's particularly critical of foreign policy makers, people that make policies for other countries and that affect other countries. They don't have skin in the game, and so those decisions are often possibly well-intentioned, but the consequences are sometimes the opposite of what's intended, and it comes down to a lack of skin in the game. But I do want to explain this, or try to explain ergodicity, because it's something that really fascinated me, and it is relevant to so many areas of life, and it's something I hadn't thought about, but it's absolutely fascinating. So if you imagine there are 100 people and they all guess, so 100, and they all guess heads or tails, and there's just a single coin flip. 100 people, what do you think the expected payout is? Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned. They get £100 if they're right, and they lose £100 if they're wrong. So what's the expected payout for the group as a whole? So the answer is 0. Okay, assuming that half the people choose heads and half the people choose tails, it's a 50-50. Half the people win, half the people will lose. So the expected payout for the ensemble, for the group as a whole, is 0, nothing, because the people that win are going to be cancelled out by the people that lose. Another way to look at that, another way to think about that is, let's say you took the first 50 and said to them all, if it's tails you win, and you take the bottom 50 and say if it's heads you win, then flip the coin. The expected payout's going to be 0. The people that lose have to pay 100. The people that win get 100. Okay, now the system is ergodic if you take just one of these individuals and perform the same experiments, this time flipping a coin 100 times for one single person. So the way this would look is that you take any of those individuals and you then say to them, okay, every time it's heads, you win £100. Every time it's tails, you lose £100. And they flip a coin 100 times. So again, what would the expected payout be after 100 flips of the coin? The answer, once again, is 0, because it's a 50-50 probability, and over time, the £100 wins are going to be cancelled out by the £100 losses. So what's true for the time probability is true for the ensemble. So if you ensemble 100 people and have them all flip one coin, the expected payout is the same as if you were to take one individual and make them perform that task 100 times. So this would be an ergodic system. This would be a fair system. You could think of it like that. Now, where it gets really interesting, so that should be fairly straightforward, but you do have to get your head around that first of all, because non-ergodic systems are very different and lead to radically different outcomes. So let's say you perform another experiment. This time you have 100 people and they're all assigned a random number from 1 to 6, completely random, and afterwards you roll a dice. If the outcome of the dice is numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, they win £1. Let's keep the maths really simple. So you have 100 people, they're all assigned a random number from 1 to 6. You then roll a dice. If the number that the dice shows is number 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, they win £1. If it's a number 6, they lose and they're completely out of the game. They forfeit completely any wins that they make or that they made previously. In this case, they're only doing it once, so that isn't relevant, but you'll see why that's relevant in a moment. So once again, what would the expected payout of this ensemble be? So 100 people, all assigned a random number from 1 to 6. You roll a dice. If it's 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, they win £1. If it's number 6, they lose. So what would the expected payouts be? Once again, it's around £82. So 5 over 6 times 100 is around 82. So the expected payout for the group as a whole would be £82. Around 18 are going to get 6. They're going to be assigned number 6. And that has a 1 over 6 probability of coming up when the dice is rolled. So they would be out of the game. Now, let's see how that works out when you perform the same experiments, this time taking one of those individuals and get him to roll the dice 100 times. And if he happens to get a 6, he loses all of the money up to that point. So quite clearly, in this kind of system, the outcome is effectively going to be zero. The expected payout is very likely to be zero. There's a very small chance he's going to get through 100 rolls of the dice, where he has a 1 in 6 chance every time of losing all of the money that he's gained so far. This is relevant for many sports, including skiing. So another way to look at this, you can think of it like this. So let's say you have a skier, a very good skier. They go to a championship where there are, say, 10 races. And in each of those races, he or she has a 20% chance of winning the race, of coming first. But also, due to the risky way that they are going about skiing, their particular way of skiing is quite risky. They have a 20% chance of being severely injured. So there's a championship, there's 10 races. This skier has a 20% chance of winning each race, but a 20% chance of being severely injured. So what is the probability? Well, how many races is this skier likely to win? So let's say so if you imagine of the 10 races, how many is he expected to win? So the answer is not 2. Some people might say 20% of 10 is 2, but the answer is actually 0.71. And the reason for this is that if he gets injured in the first, second or third, or any of them except the last, it's irreversible. He can't win future races if he can't participate in future races. So the probability that the expected number of wins is much less due to the irreversibility of an outcome and the risk that somebody is taking on. So these two examples that I've given should hope to explain how what's true for a group of individuals is not the same as what's true for an individual across time. Across time, there are many risks, and even if they're very small, those small risks taken every day over a long period of time will become more and more significant. And so one thing that's implied in all of Nassim Taleb's books is the potential for a blow-up, because the probabilities look small on paper, but the accumulation of tail risks could mean that the system is much more vulnerable than people think. The reason why this matters is because another thing which I've really found interesting in the book is often you hear economists talk about how there's rampant inequality in the world, and they often say, well, the top 1%, they have much more than everybody else. I don't know what the exact number is, but perhaps they have over 50% of the total wealth is owned by a very, very small number of people. And so there's kind of a pyramid, a steep pyramid when it comes to wealth distribution. But one of the things Nassim Taleb talks about is economists who make these points are not considering ergodicity, because it's not the same people in those different wealth brackets. And people would be quite surprised to learn about how much social mobility, how much churning there is, how much rotation there is in the US in particular. So he actually says it. I think it's 10% of Americans will for 1 year of their lives be within the top 1%. Okay, it says it here. Consider that about 10% of all Americans will spend at least 1 year in the top 1%, and more than half of all Americans will spend a year in the top 10%. So more than half of all Americans will spend a year in the top 10%. He goes on to say, this is visibly not the same for the more static, but nominally more equal Europe. So Europe is more equal if you think that the economy is static and that the top 1% is the top 1%, and the people that are comprised of the top, if the people in the top 1% remain the same, then you could think that this is unfair. But Nassim Taleb makes the point that it is changing, it's dynamic, it's a moving system. People at the top, they could fall down and become poor, they could go bankrupt. He makes the point in the book, he says that paradoxically, when in 2016 it came about that Donald Trump, who was candidate for the US presidential election, when it came about that he went bankrupt, had gone bankrupt, that didn't have a negative impact on the way people perceived him. It had the opposite effect, because people could see that he has skin in the game, he's taking risks. And so Nassim Taleb makes the point that people don't mind if people are rich, if they've earned it and if they've taken risks and they have downside, if they have skin in the game. So if there's a possibility they could lose money, and in this case Donald Trump did, people can tolerate that and they don't mind that. And indeed in the US there's a celebration of entrepreneurs. One of the things that Taleb really promotes in the book is how entrepreneurs are the driving force behind progress, and we really should champion entrepreneurs. He makes the point that when there is immobility in the system, when the people at the top remain at the top because it's called rent seeking, they've designed the laws and the economy in such a way as to make it very hard for people to move up. That's when there's instability and the possibility of revolution. And he talks about how systems can be very unstable if people are not able to fall down, because that means that people are also not allowed to rise up. But if, for example, if you take ergodicity to the extreme, and let's say there was extreme wealth inequality, some people are very rich, some people very poor, but let's say everyone on the planet spent equal time in the top 1%, in the top 10%, and in the bottom 10%. If that was perfectly rotated, then in a sense that is an equal society. If everyone had spent equal time in those different brackets, okay, that's very far from what exists. But nonetheless, the system is a lot more dynamic than people think. There are plenty of stories where people go from nothing and pull themselves up, get lucky in some cases, and become incredibly wealthy. So that was really interesting, because I never thought about that, because economists talk about the top 1%, the top 10%, but that's not comprised of people who are permanently entitled to be in those groups. And in Nassim Taleb's view, society should be organised so that people can fall down and people can move up, and that this is a better system. It's more anti-fragile. So this book is littered with things like that, which really take your breath away almost, and really force you to go and research what some of these rather complex mathematical concepts are and how they impact the world. Again, in Nassim Taleb's usual way, he is quite an original thinker in the sense that he's quite scatterbrained as well. He brings in subject knowledge from so many different areas that I have to say, his set of books are some of the most compelling I've read. So feel free to check this one out. I would actually recommend reading all of Taleb's books. I made the mistake of reading them in the wrong order, which doesn't matter too much because he goes backwards and forwards. He talks about anti-fragility in this book, which was the subject of his previous book, and he goes back to the black swan and fooled by randomness. So it's absolutely fascinating. I couldn't recommend these books high enough. Do check it out. Thank you.